Whenever I'm out preaching and teaching, I oftentimes pick a lesson that I've just recently looked at. And since we've been out of school for a couple of months, that wasn't the case. I couldn't look at just any lesson. But yesterday we began Minor Prophets 2. And in Minor Prophets 2, we look at the books of Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The last 4 books of the Old Testament, the books of the Minor Prophets. And I began a study yesterday of the book of Zechariah, or the book of Zephaniah. And so I thought that would be a good book for us to look at this evening. I found it interesting over the years, and I've preached about Zephaniah a few times, not a lot, but a few times. But I've had a lot of people come up to me at different times, and in fact I had someone yesterday say something to me. I don't know that I've ever studied the book of Zephaniah. I've read the book, but I'm not sure that I've ever studied it. Well, so I thought I would give in part an overview, but also in more of a practical way, look at a practical exhortation that Zephaniah gave. Well, the book of Zephaniah was written by a man named Zephaniah. However, when we go back to the Old Testament, we find that there were actually 4 different Zephaniahs over different periods of time. But Zephaniah the prophet would have been a great-great-grandson of Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah was probably one of the last kings in Israel that was a good king. He was good in a lot of different ways. He lived during the days of Isaiah. And because of his influence, the people of Israel then, their judgment against, or people of Judah, the judgment against the people of Judah was then postponed for a time period. Now, God brought judgment against the nation of Israel, the northern tribes of Israel, about 135 years before he brought it upon the nation of Judah. And the judgment of Israel was brought upon them by the nation of Assyria. It is interesting that Zephaniah prophesied concerning the end of Assyria. And in the 2nd chapter is a woe against the nation, and one of the nations that he prophesied against was the nation of Assyria. So we believe then the book of Zephaniah was written before the destruction of Nineveh, which was the capital city of Assyria. So when we look at the book of Zephaniah and we look at the prophet himself, we really find a number of different things. Zephaniah approaches his prophecy in much the same way that other prophets did. We have in the beginning of the book of Zephaniah the reason for the judgment, or the announcement of judgment against them. That's chapter 1. Then we have a call to repentance to the nation, and that's chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Then you have the woe against the nations, the remainder of chapter 2, and then the woe against the city of Jerusalem, which was, and actually it's the nation of Judah, which is in the early part of chapter 3. And then finally, he ends up with some basic prophecies concerning the Messianic kingdom and the promises of redemption for the people of Israel, or actually the spiritual Israel. So as we look at the book of Zephaniah then, I think one of the things that we must do in order to understand the book of Zephaniah is to understand the key verse. Look at chapter 1, and in verse 12, this is what Zephaniah wrote. And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with candles and punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. Well, I think there are 3 lessons that we can learn from this particular verse. That the prophet was searching out Jerusalem with lamp, or with a candle in the King James, but it's the idea of lamp. And it's like the idea of looking for something in a room, and we look and we look and we look, and we finally go get a flashlight, and we're looking in more an intense way. Well, that's what the prophet did as far as Israel was concerned, or as far as Judah was concerned. He looked at Jerusalem. He was examining Jerusalem with a lamp. He was looking for the various things that needed to be corrected in the nation of Judah. Then the second thing he said concerning the men settled on their lees, or the people settled on their lees, that God would punish those that were settled. And that simply means, and has reference to a person who is just sitting back, doing nothing, doesn't really expect anything, doesn't really expect to be doing anything. He's just simply taking it easy. And these men, rather than acting upon what the prophets had said to them, rather than doing what God said, they were settled in their lees. They were sitting back, eating, drinking, and being merry, as Haggai would talk about, and others would talk about concerning this matter. And then the final thing is that, and I believe this final idea in this particular verse is the key idea of their sin. It's what really all their sin goes back to. And in fact, because of Romans chapter 1, I believe all sin really goes back to this idea. Notice he said, and they say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil. In other words, they had not a proper respect toward God. They saw God as nothing more than an idol god. Now you think about the idol. And, here it is, a work of man's hands. He takes a piece of wood or a stone and he overlays it with gold and silver. He puts precious metal and precious stones on top of it, and he worships this God. Well, what does that God can do? Well, he can't do anything. He can neither do good, nor can he do evil. And I've always found it interesting when you look at the prophets, the major prophets, and especially the prophet Isaiah. He said the only time that they ever move is when they are on the mantle and they start rocking when the approaching army comes. And he says that they're quivering for or because of the approaching army. And you could just imagine the ground moving and the idol moving and rocking back and forth. Well, that's the most life there is in an idol. And that's how they viewed God. Well, if we view God in such a way that we see him as nothing more than an idol God who can neither do good or can do evil, what's that going to lead to? All kinds of despicable behavior. The theme of the book of Zephaniah is the great day of the Lord. Look down at verse 14. And he actually spends quite a bit of time on the great day of the Lord. But in verse 14 he said, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near. It hasteth greatly. Even the voice of the Lord, or the day of the Lord, and the mighty men shall cry there bitterly. And then he describes that day as a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm, etc. And so he described that great day of the Lord. Now when we look at the great day of the Lord in the New Testament age and in the New Testament, we know that the great day of the Lord is a reference to the judgment day. And we're talking about the end of time judgment. Well, it is interesting when you go back to the Old Testament, much of the time, if not nearly all the time, the great day of the Lord was a day of judgment, but it was a temporal judgment against different ones. It was a temporal judgment against the nation of Israel. It was a temporal judgment against the nation of Judah, as in this particular case. And that God would raise up nations to punish them. Now the Jews, they had a different idea about it. And it's kind of like you talk to denominational people, and sometimes, sadly to say, even members of the church, they have a false sense of security. And they think, well, the great day of the Lord's coming and he's going to punish all the evil people, and we exclude ourselves from that. Well, that's the way the Jews thought about it. They were Abraham's seed, and Brother Russ was talking about that this morning, that they were Abraham's seed. We can't be punished. We are Abraham's seed. And we've not in bondage to any man. Well, it was a false sense of security. And that's what the Jews had. They did not see the great day of the Lord, that they would have a part in that. They thought it was only against the nations around about. Well, it will be, or would be, against the nations round about. When Assyria came down, they didn't just punish Israel, they punished the nations round about, as was prophesied by Isaiah. And when the Babylonians would come, they would not bring judgment only against the nation of Judah, but other nations round about would be a part of that. Look over to chapter 2. You have the first set of woes, and there's the woe against the nations. And he began with, this is verse 4, he began with the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. Well, those various cities are the cities of Philistia. And he would spell that out in the latter part of, the latter part of verse number 5. He says, O Canaan, the land of the Philistines. Well, that's who that prophecy was against. These were 4 of the 5 major cities of Philistia. And Philistia would be a part of the punishment that the Babylonians would bring upon them. Later on in verse 8, he would talk about Moab and Ammon. Remember, Moab and Ammon were nations that descended from Lot and from an improper relationship with his daughters. And so with one daughter you have the nation of Moab, with the other daughter you have the nation of Ammon. But God's people, or the nations of Ammon and Moab rather, would be punished by the Babylonians. Later on, look at verse 12. Ye Ethiopians also shall be slain by the sword. And so even though he would mention the Ethiopians specifically in chapter 3 as part of the Messianic covenant, and yet the Ethiopians would receive the punishment that would come from the Lord. The great day of the Lord will affect the Ethiopians. And then finally, look at verse 13. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness. Well, so Assyria then, the great nation of Assyria, the world power of Assyria, would be punished because of what they did. Now, when you think about the great nations of the world, and we, in our present time, we think about the United States, we think about maybe the Soviet Union, or at least that's the era that I grew up in. And who would have thought 50 years ago that the Soviet Union would be destroyed? And yet it was. And I believe God works in the hand of nations just as He did in the past. And I believe that's fulfilled in, or it talked about in, Romans chapter 13. And He moves nations, and He raises up nation, and He destroys nation, as Jeremiah prophesied in chapter 18. Well, so He raised up Assyria. And Assyria was God's discipline against the nation of Israel. But then He raised up the Babylonians, who would be God's disciplining arm against the nation of Assyria, and it would be destroyed, and the city of Nineveh would be destroyed. It would be destroyed so badly that it was, interestingly, agnostics of the past would say that, hey, Nineveh never existed. And of recent years, the past 100 years, we have discovered where Nineveh is, and one mound, by the way, of Nineveh is called the Jonas Mound. But let me say that in English, Jonah Mound. Well, you know, it's named after Jonah because Jonah prophesied against the nation of Assyria, and he prophesied against Nineveh. And so it was the case that Nineveh was completely destroyed, hidden under the sand for almost 2,000 years. And so it is then that Zephaniah's prophecy was fulfilled. But the main part of the lesson is really from chapter 3. If you will, open your Bibles to Zephaniah chapter 3. And we want to look at verses 1 through 4. And this is the prophecy, or the woe against the city of Jerusalem. Now we know that Jerusalem was supposed to be a righteous, or the capital of Judah. And they were supposed to be a righteous people. They were God's own people. But yet there were these woes pronounced upon them. You would expect the woes upon the Philistines. I mean, after all, they'd been battling the people of God for centuries. You would expect the woe against the Moabites and the Ammonites. And again, you have them constantly battling against God's people, the nation of Israel. And I'm talking about the United Nation of Israel. And you would expect the woe against Assyria. The Jews did not expect, and sometimes we think that God's chosen people were the Israelite people or the Jewish people, and that God preserved that nation. But He really preserved that nation in order to bring about the Christ child, and for no other reason than to bring about the Christ child. But here's the situation in Jerusalem and in Judah at this particular time. In verse 1, he said, "Woe to her that is filthy and polluted, to the oppressing city. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in the Lord, she drew not near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions, her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bone till the morrow. Her prophets are lied and treacherous persons. Her priests have polluted the sanctuary, and they have done violence to the law." And so it is then that he prophesied concerning the nation of Judah, and specifically the nation of Israel, and he pronounced some woes upon her because of the situation that existed there. And he began with the idea in verse 1 of chapter 3, the calamities pronounced. And here's the calamity that would be pronounced upon them. They were a filthy people, and the word filthy in some translations have the word rebellious. They were a rebellious people. In other words, they had, rather than being God-willed and following the will of God and doing what God said, they were self-willed and full of pride. And you could just imagine as the prophets prophesied to them. Now, Zephaniah would have lived during the time of Nahum, possibly during the time of Jeremiah. And there were horrible things that existed during Zephaniah's age. And he actually addressed some of those things, and we simply don't have time to address all of those. But they were a self-willed people. They were rebellious against God. They were literally shaking their fist at God while doing their own will rather than submitting to the will of God. Then he said that they were a polluted people. Great sins had raised her ugly head in the nation of Judah. And we're talking about different social problems that they had, different religious problems that they had. And really one of the greatest religious problems that existed in the nation of Judah at that time is what exists today. Same basic problem. What's that? We take the will of God and we mix within it the will of man. And we depart from God's will by doing such. Now, it's not that they completely rejected the will of God. They just inserted their own will into it. And they mix idol worship with godly worship, that is, that which is authorized for the Israelite people and the Judah people, but they mixed it with idol worship. And so they worshiped the various idols. They worshiped the sun. They had prophets or priests that were called Malcolms, and they were served by those rather than God's people. And so they were a polluted people, morally and religiously. And then they were oppressing people. Now, I don't know about you, when I think about this particular thing, because God had blessed them and God had provided for them the seed of Abraham, they were a part of it, they became proud, and so proud that they were oppressing to other people. You know, it's like, I think about different stores that I've been in, and we've had, probably most of us have had retailers and store clerks that they think pretty highly of themselves because of where they work, and they're looking down their nose at you like they're greater than you. And all the time when they're doing this, I'm thinking to myself, hey, You're nothing but a store clerk. Give me a break. I mean, but we know people that are like that. Well, that's the way the Jewish people were. They were looking down their nose at the people of the world. And rather than being compassionate and being compelled with the love of God, to show that love and to show that interest in people of the world and show and proclaim the gospel or the way of God to the people of the world, which was required of the Israelite people. I mean, think about going back through the Old Testament and the various ones that we have recorded. We almost think that, well, God had established the nation of Israel and they were the only ones that could be right with God. But God sent them into the Gentile world oftentimes. And I think a case in point is the prophet Jonah being sent to Nineveh. And they were under the patriarchal law, but nonetheless they were still under law. And they could be saved if they so desired to be saved. And yet instead of being the kind of people that God wanted them to be, they were an oppressing people. They oppressed the Gentiles rather than looking at it. Well, then, not only do you have the calamity proclaimed, you have changes proclaimed as well. Now, or charges proclaimed as well. Look at verse 2. In verse 2, again, he said, she obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in the Lord, she drew not near to her God. So as we look at verse 4, there are 4 charges made against the nation of Judah. He said they obeyed not the voice. Now what voice would he be talking about? He's talking about the voice of the prophets and the priests. The priests and the prophets were responsible to teach Israel. They were responsible to teach Judah. And so here they are. They're going out preaching and teaching and those kind of things, and the people close their ears from it. Well, how often do you find within the Old Testament where various men are told to stop prophesying unto us, speak unto us smooth things? That's what they said to Jeremiah. That's what they said to Isaiah. That's what they said to other prophets as well. Speak unto us smooth things. In other words, tickle our ears and tell us what we want to hear rather than telling us what we need to hear. And so they did not listen to the voice of the prophet. They'd closed their minds, they'd closed their hearts to what God's men were proclaiming to them. How sad it is. But is it not true also today? It's amazing to me when you look at these kind of prophecies. And I always think about Paul's proclamation to the young evangelist Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 and following, that he said, I charge thee before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when men will not endure sound doctrine, but will heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears, and will turn their ears from the truth and be turned into fables. But watch thou in all things, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. For in doing such, thou shalt both, well, I just jumped over to chapter 4, verse 16. Thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee. That's not there in that particular place. But nonetheless, they did not obey the voice of the prophets. And then they received not correction. And so it was that even though the prophets had preached to them of how to correct their lives and how to make changes within their lives, they didn't make the changes. And it was really much like it in Jesus' day. And you look at the words of Jesus as he proclaimed to the Jewish people of the first century. Did they really make the changes within their lives for the most part? No. They stayed in their sin. They had the light of the gospel proclaimed to them, but they continued to walk in the darkness of death. And so then he said, they trusted not in the Lord. And again, as we mentioned in chapter 1 in verse 12, concerning the purpose, well, all the various sins really go back to the fact that we do not trust in the Lord. You know, think about Hezekiah. Now, Zephaniah being the great-great-grandson of Hezekiah. And the Assyrian army had come against the nation of Judah. And so Hezekiah turned to God. And you remember Rabshakeh, who was one of the officials from Nebuchadnezzar, or from the Assyrian army. He came upon Jerusalem and he talked to them about what the Assyrian army was going to do to them. And well, there were different ones that became discouraged and different ones that came to Hezekiah. And Hezekiah, he went to the temple and he prayed to God. And Isaiah responded to him and he said, they're not going to take Jerusalem. God, listen to your voice. God will do with them as He pleases. And so Hezekiah had to trust in the Lord. He didn't immediately eliminate the nation of Assyria, but he sent the Assyrian leader back to Nineveh, and he was killed by his sons. And so it is that Hezekiah had to learn to trust in the Lord. And so it was as far as the people of Judah was concerned. They needed to learn to trust in the Lord. Brethren, is it not the case that we must also do the same? Oh yeah, we go through those various problems of life. Oh yeah, we go through those various struggles of life, and we have those various struggles. There's no doubt about it. But do we trust in the Lord as we go through those struggles? That's the question. You know, we have to have the confidence the Lord's going to do what's best for us. And even though it might not seem like it at that particular time, but you know, it's the struggles that make us stronger. And we must remember to trust in the Lord as we go through those various struggles. And then finally he said they draw not near to God. In other words, there were no spiritual growth on their part. They just simply did not grow. They were not studying. They were not growing in the Word of God, and so therefore they were not growing themselves because they'd closed their ears to that. Of all the people you would think that would not be involved in this would be those various leaders of the Jewish people. And yet verses 3 and 4 talk about the leadership of that. Well, if it is no wonder that the Jewish people went off into captivity ultimately and was judged of the great day of the Lord, because they followed the leadership. Of all the people that ought to be able to stand strong is the leadership. And yet that wasn't the case in Judah at that particular time. Now we have to remember that Judah was a theocracy, and that simply means they were ruled by God. It's not like a democracy, it's not like socialism or whatever other type of state that we might have, but rather they had a theocracy. They were ruled of God. And in that theocracy, the political leaders were just as responsible for teaching and for instruction and for being the example as the religious leaders were. And so he mentions in verse 3 both the princes and the judges. Well, those were political leaders. And he said the princes were like roaring lions. In other words, they were all bark and no bite. They were all bark and no action. And so they roared like a lion to be heard, and everybody could hear them. But then their lives did not reflect that. Well, how many religious leaders do we know like that? They roar like a lion and they're heard. But when you start examining their lives, no, there's nothing in their lives that really reflect what's right. Then he said their judges were like evening wolves. Now the evening wolf, if you know anything about a wolf will devour what it has and leave nothing for the morning. When a wolf takes down its prey, he eats it all up, and he might go for days without eating again because he ate it all up. Now, I think most of us would recognize that, hey, if you get a big banquet of a meal, like a big deer or elk or something like that, you'd want to save a little bit for the next few days, and have a little bit as you go. But that's not the evening wolves. The evening wolves, they devoured it all. And in fact, he says, her judges are evening wolves. They gnaw not the bone till the morrow. In other words, they don't save anything. They eat it all up immediately. Well, that's the way the judges were. In other words, they saw the immediate profit of what they could find, and that's all they could see. They did not see the overall best interest of the people. They looked at it, what can I do to profit from the people right now, rather than looking at the overall picture. And then the prophets, they were insolent and treacherous. He said specifically, and the prophets are light and treacherous persons. Now, what in the world does that mean? What it means is that they did not take seriously their responsibilities. And how many times have we sat in an auditorium and we've listened to a man, he gets up and he tells a joke or he tells a story or whatever, and he's never serious about what he's really teaching. I've heard him over the years, and I'm always amazed. How can you be that way? Don't you realize this is, when we're talking about the Bible, we're not talking about a comic book type situation. We're talking about something that's real, something that ought to be serious. Now, does that mean we cannot tell a humorous story during a lesson to illustrate a point? Well, of course not. Does it mean we cannot at least enjoy something that's told within the Scriptures? Well, of course not. But it does mean that we better take the message of God seriously. And the prophets of the Old Testament, other than the faithful prophets, they did not take the message seriously. They weren't concerned with God's message. And in my judgment, that's reflected by the way that oftentimes some folks dress. Have you ever thought about that? As I was growing up, a person dressed in a certain way because it showed respect. But oftentimes today, we dress down because it does not show respect. And in my judgment, and it is my judgment, and I realize that, you go back to the 1960s and the hippies of California, and they taught us how to dress, and they said, well, if God's not concerned with the way you dress, well, it's not so much that God's concerned with it as it is that you reflect your attitude by the way you dress. Think about it for a moment. The business world knows that. And they expect certain men to dress certain ways because it shows respect. And we ought to be considerate of that as well. Do we really respect God? And I've had different ones over the years say to me, and I think about one specific fella, he was a good man, don't get me wrong. But he said, you don't have to dress that way. And I said, well, if you think I'm dressing because of you, you're mistaken. I'm dressing because I want to show respect toward God when I worship Him. I think if we really start thinking that way, we would dress differently. Are we showing respect by how we dress? I think it's something we ought to consider. The prophets were insolent people. They weren't concerned with showing respect toward God. They were only concerned with the enjoyment of the moment. And finally, the priest, he said they were polluted and violent to the law. Now, what in the world does it mean? He said they polluted the sanctuary. In other words, rather than being respectful toward God and bringing in the type of sacrifices that God wanted, they brought in not the best of the flocks, but they brought in the worst of the flock. They brought in the sick sheep. They brought in the injured sheep. They brought in the injured bull to sacrifice unto God. They polluted the sanctuary in that way, and they brought violence to the law. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, I tell the guys there at school sometimes, I'll use the expression, they treat the Scriptures like a New York lawyer. They twist it, make it sound, and make it say what they want it to say rather than letting the Scriptures speak. And so they did violence to the law. Well, we have to allow the Scriptures to speak, and we cannot decide what we want it to say, and then we take the Scriptures and we twist and turn it to say anything that we want it to say. We cannot allow that to happen. That's what the people of Judah was doing. And what was the result? Well, if we get our date for the book of Zephaniah right, which would be somewhere around 725 BC, in 625 BC rather, in 586. Now, how many years is that? Well, we're talking about 40 years later. The Babylonian army would encroach upon the nation of Judah, and Judah was taken off into captivity. For 70 years, they were in captivity to Judah. There were actually 3 deportations of Judah to Babylon, and 3 returns of the Jewish people in coming back. And all 3 of them are about 70 years apart, just as prophesied by Jeremiah. For 70 years, they were separated from Jerusalem. For 70 years, they were separated from the temple and from worship. For 70 years, they could not worship correctly because God had punished them. How sad. And yet, it would not be right to end the sermon and end this lesson with making application. Is it not the case that because of the departure of the people of God, I'm talking about the Church of Christ, that many congregations have folded, have just been incorporated into the denominational world, and quite frankly, when you walk into the doors of some churches, and I'm talking about churches of Christ, into their assembly, and you cannot even tell the difference between them and the denominational world. Now, I know that's the case. I was asked to go to a particular congregation in Missouri. Oftentimes, congregations will call us up at the Bible Institute of Missouri and say, well, can you send a student down and let them preach at this congregation? And Jerry will sometimes say, Chuck, would you go there the first one? And I remember going to this particular congregation and walking in, and I literally thought, and I'm not talking about 15 minutes into it, and I thought I was walking into a Christian church. How sad. How sad. And so consequently, we did not send students to that particular place. Well, you see, some churches have departed. Why? Same charges that was made in Zephaniah's day. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about Zephaniah, and you can't say that you've never studied the book of Zephaniah. We've looked at it, and we've not gone into great detail, but nonetheless we've looked at the book and saw the various things that the prophet Zephaniah charged the people of Israel. But there's light in the end of the tunnel, in that he gave a discourse concerning the prophecy concerning the Messianic kingdom, and if Judah had changed, had repented, the outcome would have been different. And so it is for us. If we repent and turn back to God and do His will and determine to do His will and His will only, the great day of the Lord will be a great day, truly a great day, when we will receive the rewards from our righteousness rather than being punished for our unrighteousness. This evening, we do want to offer the invitation. There may be someone that would like to respond to it. If you're subject to the invitation, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing to encourage you.